All right, everyone, welcome back to the impending second game of the 2019 Old School World Championship played in Las Vegas. I'm Brian Weissman. I'm here with my good friend, Sam Tang, and we just finished bringing you the action of the semifinal. And before we hop into game two, I figured we'd talk about sideboard decisions.
Absolutely, and we're looking at some deck lists, beautiful cards, beautiful deck tech, and let's talk about the sideboard options here. So we got Grixis Atog here on the right. And Brian, what are you thinking about, in your head when you're sideboarding against Eric here?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I mean, look at the history on display right here. So many betas in one place. So anybody who's played Old School is well aware that a lot of these games really come down to the sideboard. It certainly happens a lot in regular constructed Magic too. Certainly in Standard, Modern, Legacy, etc. You kind of often live and die from the sideboard. That is never more true than in this format. And in fact, so much of your ability to navigate in this case, 9-round tournament is predicated on your understanding of the sideboard, what you are likely to face, and what can you do without, even if it might in fact make your deck stronger. One of the things that I always keep into account when I sideboard or when I construct my sideboards is that I make sure that I have a one-to-one interaction between what I want against a particular opponent and what I have available in the sideboard, and more importantly, what I can remove from the deck safely without compromising too much of what the deck is all about. And being able to understand exactly what tools in your deck matter the most in that particular matchup, which ones are dispensable and which ones are indispensable, is one of the highest mastery level things you can acquire in any format, and certainly in Old School. And I've been sideboarding decks in Old School for 30 years. At this point, and I certainly have a good understanding about where the vulnerable points are in my strategy, and also what my opponent is likely to bring in against me. So I'll start right now with what I went with my own sideboard. And in fact, I'll throw the question to you, Sam. As someone who has dabbled in Old School a little bit, certainly you've played your fair share of Modern. I guess that's your favorite format.
Exactly.
And honestly, not too dissimilar in terms of how the decks interact and what they really want to do. So looking at my deck and knowing what you know about Eric's design, Eric Froelich, of course, playing Grixis Atog on the right side. Looking at Eric's design, looking at my deck, and me sort of not having seen every single card in Eric's deck, of course, we somehow magically did not see Serendipity.
Yeah, I don't know what the percentage is on that for not seeing.
I think we ran the math on it because we calculated based on the number of cards that Eric drew that game. Consider that he looked at his opening hand, he cast and resolved 2 Ancestral Recalls alongside Timetwister and Wheel of Fortune. He also cast Demonic Tutor at one point to draw another card essentially out of his deck. And through all of those draw steps, something like 55 cards, he never ever saw a single Serendipity, not in play, not in his hand, just completely AWOL.
And he ran 4 of them.
And he
was shuffling and everything.
It was bizarre, honestly. Just bizarre RNG, but I mean, it does happen. I think it was a lower than 1% outcome, roughly, based on the number of cards. Extremely, extremely high variance outcome. And so I don't know that he has Serendipity in his deck. I never saw one. I got to assume he's got them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the deck list. It's
the deck list, right? Exactly. And Eric got a little bit mana flooded in the first game, kind of midway through. It was actually really the saving grace, because man, was I on the back foot that entire game.
Yeah, you barely got out with the skin of your teeth.
Exactly. At precarious life totals for most of the game, having to essentially assume that I was dead in his hand for most of the game,
right?
And playing accordingly, which meant that I had to hedge all of my mana for so long. I had to put myself in so many really difficult, awkward positions in order to make sure that I couldn't die to the range of cards in his hand. And along the way, I absorbed well over 20 points of damage from him and managed to weather the storm and survive despite the fact that he did in fact draw so many cards. So looking at my deck list here, Sam, what do you think you would change about my deck versus his deck based on the information that we saw in the first game?
Well, we had a lot of Black Fives, we had a lot of Onks, so clearly we're going to be bringing in more Divine Offerings, and also that Ivory Tower with that sweet, sweet life gain. It's just so critical.
So critical, exactly. There's 2 kind of versions of Grixis Atog in this format. There's the Grixis Atog version, which runs the artifact suite, it runs a ton of burn, it runs early pressure, and then it intends to kind of win the game off the card drawing spells after it's whittled you down. And then there's another version of this deck which removes the black component more so. It's basically just blue-red, and it switches from being an artifact-based direct damage strategy to being a counterspell-based direct damage strategy. That deck is known as Counterburn. And Counterburn is actually one of the hardest opponents for the deck in this format. The chief reason is because the deck runs Energy Flux. It usually sideboards up to 4 copies of Energy Flux, sometimes even starts with Energy Flux main deck. And looking at my design, you can just see if there's something the deck hates, it's Energy Flux. Oh God, it's so backbreaking. And the thing, actually, I may have mentioned this before in the other video, but the chief vulnerability that you shoulder when you switch from the standard 5-color version of Control in this format to the much leaner and more mana-consistent 3-color Esper version. I mean, you can see I've got a Fireball and a Regrowth, but I don't have any red-producing lands in the deck, nor green ones, besides Cities of Brass. With that version, you don't have access to red Elemental Blast. And red Elemental Blast is incredibly powerful against both Counterburn, and honestly, it's good against Grixis Atog too, because you can stop their power cards, and you can stop Serendipity. Most importantly, against the Counterburn deck, you can blow up Energy Flux. So against the Counterburn deck, you don't have to leave all your disenchants in. You can actually just get Red Blast to cover that hole for you, to cover that vulnerability. And then, of course, the Red Blast also kill Serendipity. They stop Sonic Blast. They stop Ancestral Recall. They stop Timetwister. They stop the things in Brain Geyser, which is played in that deck also, and Mana Drain. So they allow you to interact also while simultaneously having extra ability to kill Energy Flux, and you pull disenchants out. You can't obviously do that when you're playing Esper. But in this matchup, it's not a problem, because he sure as hell is not running Energy Flux in a deck with 4 Black Vices and 4 Unks of Mishra and the jewelry set and everything else. So I know that I don't have to worry about that, which makes me a hell of a lot stronger. Outside of the cards you already recommended, 2 Divine Offerings and Ivory Tower, which I completely agree with, what else would you add here potentially from the sideboard?
You probably want to add Blue Blast in there.
I like that idea too. And
because there's just so many burn spells.
There's tons of burn spells, and how many Blue Blasts would you bring in? Questions, do you bring in all 4?
I'm thinking 2.
2.
I feel 2 or 3. I don't know about 4. Because at that point, Eric, I think, is going to be changing up his game plan as well. And then also you have Ivory Tower to just soak up, all those lightning bolts and chain lightnings that you're like, okay, why do I need to counter this when I can just gain the life?
I'm going to ask you, would you bring in Circle Protection Red against him?
I don't think so, because if you miss on the Onks and the Black Vices, the Circle of Protection Red just kind of doesn't do anything anyways. And then also, if you do ever see one of those Ifrits, those things are blue. So I don't think so.
Yeah, I think your read is perfect, actually. And this is an example, actually, where an inexperienced deck player might see a deck that's running 8 burn spells. And Earthquake, too. Remember, we got Earthquaked in the game, and it would have been lethal. And 4 Atogs also. And potentially more sources of red damage in the sideboard, and they might conclude certainly that COP red would be good. Except that's definitely a trap. Because a good Atog player is going to understand how weak those bolts are against you, particularly the Chain Lightnings. Garbage. It's 3 damage for 1 mana, but you're not going to generally win with bolts. You're going to win with artifact damage, containment, and Wheel of Fortune, Timetwister. Card draw that refills you while you gum up your opponent's hand with cards and onks and stuff. That's how you win the game. You're not bolting them to death. And you're going to be giving up a lot of that burn in order to bring in interaction in the form of Shatter and Red Elemental Blast. Obviously, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but that's the basic idea. And as you modify the deck to make the deck more control-y, more interactive and less direct damage-y, the red damage component goes down and down and down. So based on that, also, Atog only deals extra damage when there's tons of artifacts in play. And if your opponent's bringing in a bunch of artifact kill, the Atog is very likely to be smaller. It might just be a Squire. And not that that's bad, but it's hardly worthy of bringing in COP Red.
Right.
So generally, COP Red, not good against Grixis Atog. It is better against Counterburn, a little bit, but not so much better. You'd probably use it there either.
Right.
So the COP Red is a trap. That card, as I mentioned before, is really in the deck to deal with the early rounds against Goblin decks. And not conducive to a Grixis Atog matchup at all, which honestly kind of morphs into a weird counter matchup after the sideboard. Mm-hmm. So I agree with all your decisions. The one thing I definitely did different is I ran 4 Blue Blasts. Because the real vulnerability of this Atog deck, particularly after sideboarding, when they're trying to play a control game against you, is jammed a tome. You can just land a tome early, and if you can protect it with Blue Blasts against 1 or 2 Shatters in their deck, they're never going to stop it. And they've pulled a lot of their offense out of the deck. They're trying to play control against you. But that's a huge vulnerability when I'm playing the real dedicated control deck, and I can stop their Shatters.
And you think that Eric is going to bring all three shatters against you?
Yeah, 100%.
Okay.
So looking at my deck, I would add 4 Blue Elemental Blasts, 2 Divine Offering, and the Ivory Tower. That's 7 cards total. You would have gone with 5. And I'm curious to know, what 5 cards would you pull from my deck?
I'm thinking about pulling out Balance.
I agree.
And I'm thinking of pulling out Abyss.
One or both?
One. You still have to deal with Squires. You still have to deal with the Atogs as a Squire size. And also, we haven't seen any of those Ifrits, but those Ifrits are coming.
You got to assume they're in there.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, for sure.
So you got one. One Balance, one Abyss.
Yeah, 1 Balance, 1 Abyss. I think we're pulling out, because we're putting in the Blue Blast. Maybe we're pulling out one of the counter spells to be more efficient there. And then, I don't know. I'm like maybe protective of bringing out like a Tome, but I don't know, or like maybe Fireball, but I don't know.
I think you're very, very close to what I ultimately went with. This is a long time ago. I played the match 4.5 years ago. But I'm pretty sure, based on my read, is that I realized that I don't really need the Abyss against this deck. I don't need the Abyss against this deck because I can answer Atog in other ways. And Serendipity Free, yeah, it's dangerous, but I have 4 Swords to Plowshares to match it. I have Counter Magic to stop it. It isn't game ending, and I have Ivory Tower to stop it in a way also. Ivory Tower can stop a Serendipity Free. It can actually make it so it's killing them, not you. It can get you ahead in life in the long run. So I don't really recognize, and I didn't even see Serendipities in the first game anyway.
Yeah.
So I cut, in my case, 2 copies of the Abyss. I cut the Balance. I cut Fireball 100%. Fireball is horrible against Grixis Atog.
Yeah.
Even though, ironically enough, I ended the game with Fireball. But that game was already over, and I could have killed him with Factories anyway.
Right.
You don't need the Fireball, and it's so bad against both Atog and Serendip. The Fireball is really in the deck as a way to hedge in a game that's gone extremely long, where all of your Factories are dead.
Right.
It also gives you the ability to sometimes kill off 2 Pump Knights or 2 Savannah Lands early. So the flexibility is good. The deck is vulnerable to Order of the Ebon Hand. The pro-white creature, the Pump Knight, because it can get past Factories.
Exactly.
So having Fireball to just pick those things off can be very, very handy. But I sideboard the card out constantly.
Yeah.
So that's 4 right there. I believe I also cut at least 2 counter spells. Because, again, going with the efficiency plan, how many cards in Eric's deck do I really need to counterspell?
Exactly.
There just aren't that many.
Yeah.
I need to stop Timetwister.
Right.
I need to stop Mind Twist. I need to stop Wheel of Fortune, but I can Blue Blast Wheel of Fortune anyway.
Correct.
So I kind of have it covered, and counterspell is just clunky.
Right.
Are you going to counterspell a Black Vice? It costs 1 mana. You know what I mean? The card just sits in your hand and does nothing. So I don't really like counterspell. It's not proactive anyway. So I think I cut 2 counterspells, 2 Abyss, Fireball, and Balance, and I believe 1 Jam-Day Tome. Because having 3 Jam-Day Tomes is a bit much against a 4 Vice 4 Ankh deck.
Yeah.
You can't guarantee that you draw Artifact Kill. And if you draw the Tome part of your deck instead of Artifact Kill, you're going to feel really stupid for having 3 of them in your deck.
Yeah.
So I kind of figured that we're going to get to mid-game, and I'll land a Tome in mid-game, weather the storm early, possibly ride Ivory Tower, get a Tome out, and protect it with multiple Blue Blasts, and he can't win.
Yep.
You just can't beat it. There's just no way to stop the active Tome.
Right.
So that's my game plan. I believe that's the sideboard that I did. So looking over at Eric's deck, if you're sitting in Eric's seat, what do you think you're adding?
We're definitely adding the Shatters like we talked about before, adding in the red Elemental Blasts, and I see Gloom there.
Gloom. Interesting card, right?
Maybe we throw in some Glooms.
Maybe you do bring in some Glooms.
I mean, all we've been seeing are like white cards to answer: Divine Offering, Disenchant, Swords to Plowshares, maybe Gloom.
Yeah, I think that Gloom, I agree with all of your assessments, actually. All of them. I guess it looks like the Mind Twist is a sideboard card rather than main deck, which is an interesting choice. But I do understand why he would do that, because truthfully, you just kind of want to play with Black Vices early. They do so much damage. They're so disruptive and annoying that to Mind Twist your opponent early, it seems like, oh, I'm way ahead now, right? I Mind Twisted him down to 3 cards, except now you top deck 2 Black Vices in a row that do nothing anymore.
Yeah.
And later on in the game, you're just casting Wheel of Fortune or Time Twister anyway to refill. So it doesn't have a ton of synergy with how the deck actually plays out, as good as that card is. So it's unlikely to, I mean, maybe you'd bring it in against me just to kind of catch me off guard, I suppose. But it is an odd choice. I think that it would be hard to keep the game plan of the deck the same while bringing in Mind Twist also. But at the same time, if he's going to try to play this much more control-y deck, sort of switching the deck over to a counterburn deck, but with Mind Twist in it instead. So he brings in Blast, and he's got Mind Twists and just ways to kind of screw you up and interact with you. And then he's planning to just kill you later on with Serendipity, then it could work. Mind Twister, hand away, and play 2 Serendipes as a strategy.
Right. And do you think here Eric will feel that you have a better mid-game and end-game, so maybe he wants to try to out-aggro you?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a possibility. Obviously, he's the core of the deck is Weiss and Ankh. You just cannot move off of that plan.
Yeah.
They're just too powerful, too synergistic, too disruptive. And they can just win the game easily if your opponent gets a little unlucky and does not draw artifact kill. If you look at my deck right now, after sideboard, I'm up to 7 of those.
Mm-hmm.
But Eric had 4 Serendipity and drew like 54 cards in the first game without seeing one.
Yeah.
So that kind of variance can happen with artifact kill too. Yeah. And you can just die to 1 Black Vice sometimes.
Right.
It's just so frustrating, but that's just the way the format is. So in Eric's situation, I think for sure, I would bring in 3 Shatters 100%. This is the match where Gloom, assuming he's not worried about White Weenie, which isn't really a force in old school anyway, although it used to be a long time ago, oddly enough. The Glooms are really intended to disrupt a deck like the deck. He's intending to just draw Mox or 2 and play a Gloom super early. And then he plays the artifacts and I can't kill him.
Mm-hmm. And
then he draws 1 or 2 Strip Mines, maybe a Shatter for a Mox, and I just never get to 5 and I can't disenchant anything. That's what the Glooms are for. So I think those come in 100%.
Mm-hmm.
3 Glooms come in, 3 Shatters, that's 6.
Mm-hmm.
Then it's a matter of whether or not he runs Mind Twist or the Red Blast. Does he really need Red Blast? Is this really the matchup that Red Blast is good in? How much am I going to actually be countering him versus how much am I just fighting with white cards?
Right.
The deck fights you and does most of its defense not with blue cards, but with white cards.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't Red Blast those. And often bringing in a bunch of Red Blasts against the deck is a mistake. I'm taking blue cards out against you and just beating you with enchantments and white cards.
Mm-hmm.
And that's more than enough, and artifacts, which is more than enough of a strategy. So I think he probably wants maybe a couple Red Blasts to interact.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe 2, plus the Shatters is 5, plus the Glooms is 8 cards.
Mm-hmm.
So again, getting back to what we were talking about at the beginning, what exactly can Eric take out without compromising the core of the deck and just making it kind of a weak control deck?
Yep.
Instead of this streamlined, multi-pronged killing machine that Grixis Atog is before sideboard. So what do you think you would take out if you were in Eric's position, assuming you're bringing in 7 to 8 cards?
Probably the Chain Lightnings first, because Lightning Bolt is strictly better. And then also, if he decides to do all 4 Chain Lightnings, and then, I don't know, maybe an Atog or 2, and then, I don't know, Earthquake. Maybe Earthquake. But yeah, you want to leave everything else, all the value stuff intact. And also, if Eric decides, well, I'm not going to just burn him out, maybe just take out the Psionic Blast as well.
Yeah, I think that, keep in mind, he's got to assume that I have other ways to gain life in my sideboard. I almost certainly have access to Ivory Tower. And Ivory Tower, man, it single-handedly can take out that entire second row of Eric's deck right there.
Right.
1 Ivory Tower sitting around for 5 or 6 turns, those are all blanks.
Exactly.
So you got to be really careful of that. You can't just keep the deck full of burn, because you're just, what if he brings in 4 Ivory Towers?
Yeah.
And he just blows up your Black Vices and you're just like, shit, he's gaining 8 a turn. What the hell do I do?
Right.
Right? And it just goes on and on and on and on and on. The other question too is, do you expect Abyss in game 2? Do you keep creatures in still? Because Abyss breaks your back if you still have 8 creatures. Killing 8 creatures, 8 cards in your opponent's hand and deck for 4 mana, and you can't get rid of the Abyss with this deck at all. He has no way to kill it outside of Orb. That's a huge vulnerability also. You can't like give your opponent kind of nascent 8-for-1s if you can avoid it. So the question is, does he keep the creatures in or remove them? It's very hard, right? Again, I was talking at the very beginning of the video about how these matches are often won and lost by these kind of sideboard decisions. You have to be able to understand not only what you need to bring in, but what you can afford to take out. And another thing, as a broader recommendation for people who want to play old school format, is when you're building your sideboard, pay very close attention to what the 5 or 6 opponents you're likely to face. There's definitely some archetypes in the format. There's the control deck. There's the burn deck. There's usually a mono black deck. There's an artifact-based deck, usually using workshops. There's like a Jeskai tempo deck. And those decks are all extremely different in terms of how they play out and what beats them. So while you might want 7 cards against the artifact deck, can you afford to take 7 cards out of your deck?
Because your deck stops stops doing what it's intended to do.
Exactly. You just compromise too much of the theme, and now you're not even playing the same deck anymore. Yeah, you're better against them, but you're not playing the same deck anymore.
You lose your win con.
Right.
Basically.
That might in fact make you worse. And sometimes you're just making your deck better against a match that it's already good against. So make sure that you figure out the 5 or 6 different types of decks you're likely to face, and figure out in advance exactly how many sideboard slots you can devote to each one of those decks, and predicate that decision on how many cards you can remove from your deck in that matchup without screwing it up. And don't have a disparity there. Have a plan for every card in your sideboard, exactly what it's for, so that you can sideboard in an instant on the fly. You don't have to like spend 15 minutes puzzling it out. So in the case of what to take out here, I basically agree with you. I think that the big vulnerable point is the weak direct damage spells have to come out. That means 4 Chain Lightning for sure. I don't think Earthquake is good against me in the matchup either. He's got to be expecting that Blue Blast comes in anyway, and tapping out to cast like a 9-mana Earthquake or something, only to have it Blue Blasted is just a game loss, basically. You just die on the spot probably, because it just opens you up to so much bad stuff. So that's very likely to come out. That's 5. I think that Lightning Bolt is so much better than Sonic Blast that you would definitely keep the bolts in before you'd keep any Psy Blasts in.
Right.
And so other than me boarding in maybe Serra Angels against them, which is an actual strategy that a lot of these old school decks do to deal with decks like Atog, they just load up on Serras in the sideboard. They've got like 3 or 4 of them, and they just start slamming Serra Angels while the guy's like screwing around with Ankhs and Mishra and stuff. They're like, oh shit, there's a Serra out on turn 2, and all my Psy Blasts are in the sideboard. Right? And now I'm trying to figure out some janky way to like block with a Serendib and bolts without having that screwed up somehow, you know, that kind of thing. Either way, the Psy Blasts don't belong unless he's expecting Serendib or Freeze. It's just not good. Serra Angels. So it's not worth keeping those in. So I think probably 4 Chain Lightning, 2 Psy Blast, Earthquake at a minimum. And then we're thinking about the creatures. Can you afford to cut Atog or Serendib? Are the Abysses still in? Hard to say. But I would say that if you wanted to bring a total of, 8 cards? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so 3 Gloom, 3 Shatter, maybe 2 Red Blasts. Mm-hmm. You'd cut those 7 and maybe 1 Atog.
Right.
Would probably be about what I'd do.
Yeah.
And I'd be unsurprised if Eric did something different from that. Or I'm sorry, I'd be very surprised if he did something different. Mm-hmm. So I think we're going to wrap up this video right now. We've actually spent a lot of time recording the sideboard before we cut to the second game. I hope you guys really enjoyed that, a deep introspective dive into sideboard strategy for 2 very disparate strategies, but 2 real pillars of old school, with Control on the left and Grixis Atog on the right. Coming up, we have the second semifinal game. I can't wait to do the commentary. Thank you for joining me, Sam, and we'll be right back with you guys soon.